They look like some sort of illustration in a mid-90s kids book about prehistoric animals, which, if you're familiar, it's a really specific aesthetic that, personally, I think deserves some kind of revival. I don't know, maybe you're familiar with the Pokemon. What's his name? Kabuto? I have to admit, my wife got me a classic Gameboy Color for Christmas, exactly like the one that I had when I was a kid. And I've put almost 20 hours into Pokemon Gold over the past 3 weeks. But anyway, the point is, they look like many things from the sea, otherworldly, ancient, relics of a bygone era, even straight made up for an animated children's television and game series that somehow manages to rely on its characters training animals to fight each other as a universe-building plot point, which is, problematic, right? I don't know. They somehow managed to simultaneously embody the moniker of Horseshoe while also looking nothing alike, other than a you-ish similarity, just as much as their sight immediately calls to mind a crab, while not being one in the slightest. I'm talking about, of course, the horseshoe crab. That's today's topic. Horseshoe crabs, their history, their very nature, and their relationships to each other, other species, us, and even our health. I'm Devin Boker. You are listening to The Wildlife. Stay tuned.
Hello. I'm all right. How are you?
The voice you're hearing belongs to today's special guest, Dr. Dr Sasson. He's a behavioral ecologist primarily interested in studying the evolution of reproductive behaviors. He did his PhD at Florida, working with horseshoe crabs, and now he conducts research on them at the South Carolina Department of Natural Resources. And as you'd expect, he's pretty much always loved science.
Even when I was a little kid, I remember my parents getting Discover magazine for me.
Oh, yeah.
And I had that throughout, probably from the time I was 7 or 8 until graduating high school. We had a subscription for that. So I was reading that all the time. Yeah. I would, my parents would watch nature documentaries and those sorts of things, but they're both in the humanities, so it was a little bit different. But yeah, in 9th grade, we had to do a project where we had to talk about what we wanted to be when we grow up and go interview someone. And at that time, I thought I might want to be an astronomer. So I went and interviewed someone at the planetarium where I grew up.
Sure.
So certainly the topics I've been interested in have changed since I was a kid, but I think I was always pretty interested in science in general, except chemistry. I don't like chemistry.
I'm right there with you. Chemistry was never my, we just don't get along, I don't think. I don't know what it is, but not my thing. But everything else, science, great. I love it. I love the concepts of chemistry, but not the actual work of chemistry. That
yeah, I don't know. My brain didn't work with it. Great, and I never found it super compelling. But teach their own, right?
Yeah. And that broad interest, that clear, consistent curiosity, it didn't fade. One look at his website and you'll see what I mean. I see cactus bugs, harvestmen. Is it ctenophores? Is that how you say it? Ctenophores?
Ctenophores.
Even though there's a big C at the beginning.
Yeah, some people say ctenophores, some people say ctenophores. I was always told ctenophores, but I don't know that there's a correct way to say it.
Sure. There's also tree hoppers and then, of course, horseshoe crabs, which is like a pretty broad range of stuff. Is there anything about these that is unifying as a whole that you're looking at them for?
Not especially, other than the fact that they're invertebrates, which makes them regulatory wise much easier to work with than vertebrates.
Sure.
But I'm generally more interested in invertebrates, but broadly, I think I'm just more interested in the questions that we can use these organisms to study. So I do a lot of reproductive behavior work. And I started off with horseshoe crabs, but there were some things I couldn't do in horseshoe crabs that I wanted to do for my dissertation. So then I was fortunate enough there was another lab at the University of Florida where I did my dissertation, Christine Miller's lab, and she was working on cactus bugs. She had recently started, and she said, if anyone is, interested in doing some stuff with them, let me know. And I was interested. So I ended up working with cactus bugs to answer some questions about reproductive biology that I couldn't do with horseshoe crabs. Because as we'll probably get into in more detail, horseshoe crabs can take like 10 years or so to mature. And so you can't really do developmental work if you want to do that sort of stuff. And so with the cactus bugs, I wanted to change their diet during development and see how that affected like male weapons and testes and these sorts of things. And that wouldn't have been possible with horseshoe crabs. So the ctenophore thing was a bit more random, but we ended up doing, I think Joe Ryan at the Whitney Lab for Marine Bioscience. I did a postdoc with him working with ctenophores, and he originally wanted me to join the lab to look at a certain question about potential sperm storage in ctenophores, and we never actually got to that question. But we ended up doing other reproductive behavior stuff. So generally, my interests are about how environmental factors or various factors affect reproductive behavior. And so all these organisms that I've worked with, those are sorts of the questions that I've been trying to answer.
Okay. Unfortunately, I've never had the privilege of seeing one of these horseshoe crabs in person. The closest I've ever been is the weirdly accurate toy one that I have in my classroom file cabinet, but I've always found them to be just fascinating. Like, you can't help but look at one and not immediately have questions. One I often hear is, are they really crabs?
No. So they are arthropods like crabs are, but they're not crustacean. So they actually are more related to spiders and scorpions. They fall in a group called the Chelicerata because they have these little chelicera, which they use to, I'm making hand gestures, you can't see that on the podcast, that they use to pinch their food and put it into their mouth. Okay. And so this is a feature that spiders and scorpions and other animals in that group have. There's actually a recent paper that came out 2 or 3 years ago that actually placed them in the arachnids,
really,
which has been sort of controversial.
I bet.
So I think that's still a little bit up in the air, but they're somewhere in that group related to spiders and scorpions and those guys.
Okay.
And I think they were just called crabs because you see a hard shell animal walking along the beach, right? And you'd say it's a crab.
Yeah.
Right.
Is
my guess.
Is the horseshoe part of it just because they have that kind of that curved U-ish shape, or I mean, is there any particular reason?
I assume that's it. Maybe they're lucky. I don't know. But I assume it's just the shape sort of looks like a horseshoe, would be my guess. Okay. Yeah.
Believe it or not, horseshoe crabs aren't just one thing, one species.
Yeah, there are 4 species. So there's one species in the U.S. That's the one I work on, called Limulus polyphemus is their scientific name. Polyphemus because they have 10 eyes, and so polyphemus means many-eyed. If you have read like the Odyssey in 9th grade class, like we had to, you remember the Cyclops was named Polyphemus, but that was sort of given to him ironically by Odysseus because he only had one eye. So it's a non-ironic name for these guys. And then there are 3 other species that live in Southeast and East Asia.
The mangrove horseshoe crab, the Indo-Pacific horseshoe crab, and
the Chinese horseshoe crab. Clearly, you can sort of guess where they live based off of these names. But the species that has the greatest population numbers is by far the one here we have in the U.S. The either called the Atlantic horseshoe crab or the American horseshoe crab is the common name for it.
That's so weird that there's like the U.S. Atlantic coast and then Asia. It's just a weird separation.
Yeah, there's some interesting, if you find some of the fossils that have been found for horseshoe crabs have been found in like Germany, present day Germany, right? So, they have we can find fossils of horseshoe crabs that go back a long time ago that look relatively similar. And so it seems that they may have been, I don't know the biogeography of horseshoe crabs, but I should state that right now, right? But it's likely you had these animals, these relatives of horseshoe crab that lived in some area, maybe even when the land masses were very different than they are now, right? And when the land masses changed and they speciated to these different species. I should say the one we have here actually goes down to the Yucatan, so you can find these horseshoe crabs in Mexico as well.
Okay.
So we call it the American horseshoe crab because it's the Americas, or the Atlantic horseshoe crab because they're still sort of on the Atlantic coast, but it's not just in the United States that you'll find this species of horseshoe crab that we have here.
Sure. So I feel like a lot of people probably have a general idea of what they look like. I mean, it's kind of a domey thing with a spiky tail. Can you
Yeah.
can you describe, maybe a little bit more eloquently than what I just did? What they look
Maybe.
like?
I don't know if I can, but I'll give it a shot. So they look a little bit like stingrays. So sometimes
Oh
if
yeah,
people see them in the water, they confuse them with stingrays,
sure.
which often leads to some misconceptions about their tail being dangerous. It's not at all. But generally, yeah, they look sort of like a helmet, or in a horseshoe shape. They have two main parts of their body, their prosoma and their epistosoma. So the prosoma is sort of like a cephalothorax, where you would generally consider like a headish area.
Yeah.
And the opistosoma is the back area where they have their tail and other things. And they have a little hinge in between these two parts of their body, and they actually can bend along that hinge. And so if you ever see a horseshoe crab and it's bent along that hinge, right where that hinge is, there's a soft part, and that goes directly down to where their heart is.
Oh.
And so that's if you're looking at the dorsal view. If you flip them over to look at their underside, their ventral view, they look pretty weird. So they look a little bit like a face hugger, the face hugger in Alien,
Oh, yeah,
the Alien movie.
Yeah.
Right. So they have these pairs of appendages, these arms that stick out that they use for walking and digging and some other stuff. And then they have these gills that are called book gills, which are pretty interesting. So they're called book gills because they look like pages of a book. They will flap up and down in the water and move and undulate. They actually can help them propel them when they're swimming a little bit. And then they have a long tail, also called a telson, that it can't hurt you at all. They mainly use it for flipping themselves back over if they get overturned on a beach.
Oh.
And along the epistosoma, they will have these little spikes and ridges. And when they're juveniles, they are really spiky on top too, on their backside. They can be pretty spiky.
Sure.
And they have two like large compound eyes on their prosoma that we'll see pretty readily. They're very large eyes, but they actually have 10 total eyes. So they have a bunch of other eyes that are a lot smaller that you don't see as well, that help them detect light and darkness and UV and these sorts of things that are thought to be used to know like the lunar cycles and tide cycles, because these things are very important for their mating behavior.
Sure.
So a lot of times you'll see them, if you see them up on a beach, you'll see all this other stuff sort of like growing on their carapace, on their shell. And that's because they have this hard carapace, and they can live for a long time as an adult. And so what they'll get are called, we call them epibionts, or they're just other animals that will live on their shell. So they'll have barnacles and various other things that will encrust their shell. And sometimes you'll see pictures of them, and they'll just be covered with these things, which presumably isn't great for them, but I don't know that we really know for sure how harmful these things are for them. I mean, at the very least, they have to not help with like their hydrodynamics and getting through the water and these sorts of things.
Yeah. One of the things about these that strike me is I have a trilobite fossil on my desk, and it's probably just one of the molts. I mean, like a huge chunk of them are, but they look pretty similar. I mean, not exact, but pretty similar. Really ancient, prehistoric looking. How long have these been around?
So a long time is the short answer. We have fossils dating back to 450 million years ago of horseshoe crab ancestors. So you'll hear horseshoe crabs be called living fossils, and that's not entirely accurate, right? So they have evolved, they have changed over time, but their body plan looks relatively similar, even going back 450 million years ago.
Wow.
We have fossils from, I think, around 150 million years ago that have been characterized to fit in the same genus, like Limulus, a Limulidae family. So that are relatively similar to what we have in present day. So not the genus, I should say, I think it's family. So they do go back a long time with very relatively similar body plans, which is really, really cool. So clearly what they have going for them has been working for them pretty well.
Yeah, apparently. And in all that time, while the world has changed 10 times over and whole other species have laid claim to the earth, horseshoe crabs have persisted. Their existence, their day-to-day, their grand biological behaviors have all gone largely unchanged. The most fascinating of which is tied to the moon.
So here in the U.S., mating occurs depending on where you are, and starting in late spring through midsummer. So in Florida, where I did work with them, they're a little bit different because the climate in Florida is different.
Yeah.
And so they will start mating in late February, early March, and go through about late April, early May, and then they'll have another season where they mate in the fall.
Sure.
From mid-September to late October. But that's different from most areas along the coast. In most places, they only have one mating season, and it usually starts in April and goes through late June or early July. So up in Maine, it will start later and end later. And then, where I'm here in South Carolina, they'll start in April and end in late June.
It's all tied to the lunar cycles, the new and full moons when the tide is highest. And when the time is right, they come up to the shore to mate.
What happens is that the females will be swimming offshore, and a male will attach to the female's back.
They call this the attached male.
Not very surprising name.
Holding on for sometimes weeks.
And so when those highest high tides are happening, the females will come up to the beach with this male attached to the back of her. She will dig down into the sand 10 to 20 centimeters or so, and she will spawn her eggs into that area that she's dug down. And so fertilization with these guys occurs externally. And so while the female is releasing her eggs, the male will also release sperm, which then will fertilize the eggs. And so sometimes it's just as simple as that. You have one female and you have one male that's attached to her, but it can be more complicated. So you have some males that don't find a female to attach to, either don't find a female or don't want to attach to a female. These questions are still sort of up in the air.
Yeah.
And what they do is they will come to the beach by themselves without a female, and they will roam the beach looking for pairs that are mating. And if they find a pair that are mating, they will join that pair and spawn as well. So they will also release sperm as the female is releasing eggs. And work my PhD advisor had done in the 90s showed that we call them satellite males. These satellite males can actually get a high percentage of that fertilization of the eggs. So when there's one attached male and one satellite male, on average, the attached male will fertilize about 80% of the eggs, and the attached male will fertilize about 20% of the eggs. Wow. But if there are two satellite males and one attached male, generally those satellite males will fertilize around 60% of the eggs, and the attached male will fertilize 20% of the eggs. And as you increase the number of satellite males in a group, sometimes I've seen 12, 13 males around one female, which seems ridiculous. You're like this male that's 2 meters away from the female. You're like, what are you doing? You're not going to be able to fertilize any eggs from there. But generally, my advisor had found, Jane Brockman, that as you increase the number of satellite males around a female, the amount of eggs that they fertilize takes away from the other satellite males.
Which only makes sense.
So this attached male still has an advantage of being attached, because it seems like generally, at a minimum, they're getting around 20% of fertilization of these eggs. But the number of satellite males can affect how well the attached males do. And we've also work in Jane and some other labs have shown that these satellite males differ from the attached males in that they're generally older and in worse condition. And so it's thought that at some point in the male's life, they will switch from being an attached male to being a satellite male. And why this is still a bit of an open question, though generally the idea is that there is some these males, the switch point is called a condition-dependent switch point. So at the point in their life where they will do better reproductively as a satellite male than an attached male, they switch to become a satellite male. And work by Matt Smith, who was a graduate student in the same lab I was in, has shown that these attached males, one reason that some males may not be able to be attached anymore is that these attached males suffer what seems like a pretty significant cost to feeding while they are attached. So they are grabbed onto this female, and that covers up some of their mouth parts that they have. And as I said earlier, they could be attached, we think, 2 or more weeks potentially. And so over that course of time, these males just may not be able to feed very well. So it seems like the work Matt did showed that they were starving.
Okay.
And so these satellite males who are older males and in worse conditions, perhaps they just can't afford that cost of not really being able to feed for 2 weeks to be an attached male, right? And so instead of doing that, they come up to the beach by themselves and hope to get some fertilization that way. So one of the things that we're still trying to figure out exactly is what drives this switch point, though. When do males go from being attached to being a satellite male? Because you will find some attached males that are really old and in bad condition, and you'll find some satellite males that look like they're in pretty good condition.
And so the females can lay eggs multiple times then, so can they mate with multiple males intentionally? Like, will it continuously be with the attached male that they came to shore with, or will they kind of break away and then pick out some others?
Yeah, so we will see them with different males. So we've tried doing some tracking at our field site in Seahorse Key. When I was at the University of Florida, we would tag individuals and mark down when they came back up. And you'll see females come back multiple times in the season, and they will often be with different attached males. But there have been some studies also in Jane's lab showing that the female has some control over whether there are satellite males or not. So females can do a couple of things. Say a female comes to the beach with an attached male and she doesn't want any satellite males. What Jane and Sherry Johnson, who was a postdoc in Jane's lab, showed is that when satellite males come up to these females, they call them intolerant females, would just get up and leave and not lay any eggs if they didn't want any satellite males. Alternatively, we've shown that these females, we call them polyandrous females because they have multiple males. They seem to have some chemical cues that they can release to draw in and attract satellite males.
Sure.
And so there was an experiment done in Jane's lab where they took, water from underneath the females and sponges and then placed them under model fake crabs. And the water from females that had multiple males, those models attracted satellite males, while the models from females that were just with the attached male didn't attract satellite males, indicating there's some cue going on there. Their females are releasing some chemical to attract these satellite males in. And so then the question is, why are some females attracting satellite males and some not? And it's potentially because of some genetic compatibility issues, or perhaps because the female realizes for whatever reason that the attached male with her is not the greatest. So I did some work during my PhD looking at the sperm of these males, satellite males and attached males, and there are differences in sperm quantity and quality with these guys. And actually the males that are attached to females that bring in multiple satellites have somewhat less sperm than the males that are attached to females that don't bring in satellites. So one possibility is that these females somehow can detect that these males on their backs are duds, are not great, and so it needs to bring in other males, right? There's also, as I said, Jane and Sherry had done some work on genetic compatibility and showed that when you fertilize and do in vitro fertilization with females with their attached male, when they're these monandrous females with no satellite males, they do better, have higher fertilization than when you fertilize those eggs with a mix of their attached male and satellite males, while these polyandrous females are the reverse. If you fertilize their eggs in vitro with only the sperm from their attached male, they do worse than if you mix sperm with satellite males and attached males and fertilize the eggs.
Interesting.
So there's probably some genetic compatibility issues or some sperm limitation issues that are driving these females' decisions. As for how they decide which males attach to them in the first place, we don't know the answer to that. My sense of it is that the females may not have a huge amount of choice in that, but
Sure.
who knows? I mean, that happens off underwater,
Yeah.
in potentially deeper
Kind of
waters,
out
and
of
so
view.
we haven't really observed out of view. We've done some, experiments in tanks trying to simulate these things, but it doesn't work quite as well when you do it in a tank. But there's a lot going on there that we still don't quite know the answers to.
Is there any kind of relation to, whether or not a female opts for more satellite males if maybe genetically it's more related to the attached male, or size? Like, is size an indicator, or age? Like, is there any kind of trend with that?
Yeah, so those are good questions. I don't think we have looked at genetic relatedness. Now that is a potential issue, right?
Yeah.
Especially if females don't have a choice. If males that are more genetically related to the female, if the females can detect that. We know in other insects and other
Yeah.
animals, there are ways to detect relatedness through sort of chemical compounds or various
Mm-hmm.
things. That could be potentially an issue, right? Because you don't want to have inbreeding
Yeah.
and inbreeding depression, which can decrease fertilization. Um, there have been some studies that have found that there is assortative mating based off size. That is like larger females will have larger males and smaller females smaller males,
Mm-hmm.
but not every study finds that. Some studies have found no trend in size assortativeness. So that's
Okay.
still a bit unclear
Sure.
about the size issue. So yeah, we don't really know. These are things that still need to be figured out about
Yeah.
what's going on with these guys and how this choice is made.
Yeah.
But those are all possibilities for sure.
How big? I've been trying to think about this. How big do these groups get then? Like when they're in their big, well, I don't even know what you would call a group of horseshoe crabs.
Yeah, spawning group. We just call them groups, I guess.
Sure.
And maybe there's a technical term that I should know and don't. So most of the time you will see, well, it depends where you are. So that I should state at first, it depends what population you are. So if you're in Delaware, where there are the most number of horseshoe crabs of anywhere in the world,
Mm-hmm.
you will get spawning aggregations that are ridiculous. So I went up there to do some work, and they measure the number of horseshoe crabs they have on a beach by using these quadrats. So these meter square things, they drop it down in random spots and count how many horseshoe crabs they have in 1 meter square. And there were times they were getting counts of like 12, 15 horseshoe crabs in one area in 1 meter. And so
Oh,
you
wow.
can't even, with that's going on, you can't even really tell which males are with which females. It's hard. It's really hard to break apart how many satellite males is in with one female. In other places, like in Florida where I worked, it was easier to tell generally, and we would have, I think the maximum we saw was 12 or 13 satellite males around a female at a time.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, but most of the time you see 1 or 2 satellite males or the female with just the attached male. But you will get these when you have higher density on the beach, when you have more individuals for whatever reason going onto the beach to spawn that one night,
Yeah.
that's when you tend to have these larger aggregations.
Okay.
These larger group sizes, but it varies throughout the season and depending on the population where you're at. There's some places, like in the Florida Keys, I believe, and where they're lower densities, population densities, and there you generally find more often than not just one female with one attached male and not the satellite males around as much.
Okay. Okay. And how many eggs? It sounds like a lot. How many eggs are these females laying at a time? Or even
At a
season?
time, so they can, I think the estimate, it depends on their body size, and
Okay.
body size changes across their distribution across the coast.
Yeah.
But generally it's thought, between 30 and 60,000 eggs in a season.
Okay.
So if you ever see a horseshoe crab, it's not a pretty sight, but if you ever see a horseshoe crab, like a female opened up, their whole body cavity is just filled with eggs
Wow.
during their reproductive season. And so they really are packing them in there to lay as many eggs as they can. But as I said, it depends on size, and the size is hugely variable
Yeah.
across the coast. So in the Yucatan or in Maine, at the northern and southern ends, they are much smaller. This is a rough estimate, but I think the average size is probably like 15 or 16
Oh,
centimeters. The carapace width, if you go across their prosoma.
yeah.
Whereas in Georgia or South Carolina, it can be for a female average like 24 or 25
Wow.
centimeters across. So it's a big
Yeah.
difference in size across their range. And my friend Matt, when he was doing his PhD, one of the things he was trying to figure out is what is driving this pattern you see across
Yeah.
populations and body size. Because it's weird. Usually you think you go in one direction and the size will vary across that whole population in that direction. But this one, there's a peak sort of in the middle of their distribution, and then it gets smaller as you go north and as you go south.
Oh, weird. Huh.
Which is weird,
Yeah,
right?
that is weird. So
Yeah.
60,000 eggs, I mean, in a season.
Mm-hmm.
If you have even a small population, that sounds like it would lead to a quite the massive horseshoe crab population at some point. So I imagine that there's some kind of issue with survivability of those
Yeah,
eggs, because
for
otherwise it would
sure.
be almost overrun. So
Yeah.
yeah, what are some of the factors that influence that then?
So there are both just natural factors and there are, anthropogenic issues going on. So a lot of things will just eat eggs,
Yeah.
right? Or even small juvenile horseshoe crabs. So the eggs may hatch, get to their what we call their trilobite stage,
Hmm.
and then they're just so small, like anything in the ocean can eat them, pretty much, right? So if you have a stable population, that means that every individual is producing one offspring that gets to adult size, right?
Oh,
So if a
okay.
female is laying 60,000 eggs, then on average, the vast majority of those will not reach it to adulthood.
Oh, wow.
Um, and yeah, a lot of that is probably predation. There, depending on where you are too, other things may happen. So in Delaware, where the density is crazy high,
Hmm.
um, you have so many horseshoe crabs on the beach at one time, so many females make digging nests that they will dig up each other's eggs
Oh,
and expose them. So if you go to Delaware or one of these high population areas after a spawning event, you will just see the beach strewn with these eggs, um, which is obviously not great for them. They need to be down in the sediment,
yeah.
10 to 20 centimeters deep so that they occasionally get, hydrated with the tide coming in. Otherwise, if they're just on the beach, birds, migratory shorebirds, all sorts of things will eat these eggs. They'll just
Hmm.
get washed out to sea and get eaten. So there's a lot. There's a lot of things that can happen to a
Yeah.
horseshoe crab before it can even make it to a decent size to be protected from most predators. I mean, horseshoe crabs, even as adults, can still be eaten by things,
Yeah.
but mainly by very large things like we're talking sharks, maybe alligators are sometimes seen eating them. Sea turtles will eat horseshoe crabs.
Sure.
But generally, once they become an adult, they're pretty safe for a while.
Hmm.
So my guess is this early mortality when they're juveniles in their first stages of life where most of the mortality occurs. Now, there are some threats due to human influence, of course, like
Yeah.
with everything else. So degradation of spawning habitat has been a big one, especially for the Asian species.
Hmm.
If like the coastlines get built up or the sand or there's dredging or any of these things, if the beaches are armored to protect them, like by putting on these, big things to help erosion
Yeah.
that can hurt potential spawning habitat. So all these things are potential issues for the horseshoe crab and their population health. There's other things as well. I mean, here in the United States, one of the big mortality for adult horseshoe crabs is harvesting for bait. So they're harvested for conch and eel and whelk bait,
Mm.
and there are limits across the U.S. in how many can be harvested, right? But that certainly plays. I think that it averages between 600,000 to a million
Oh,
per
wow.
year that are harvested for bait. So that obviously has an effect on, on the
Yeah.
population. But as I said, there are regulations in place for that. Delaware has moved to a male-only harvest, right, with the idea that you still need the females to be able to produce the eggs.
Yeah.
We have enough males in the population to fertilize all these eggs.
Sure.
So that has probably helped a bit in the population numbers. I think New Jersey has gone and banned harvesting of horseshoe crabs for bait. Here in South Carolina, there's no harvesting for bait. But that is probably one of the larger causes of premature adult mortality, I should say. Obviously, they will die on their own. They can live as adults about 10 years. These guys are pretty long lived.
Yeah.
It takes about 10 years to become an adult, and then they can live for about 10 years. After that, though, aging of horseshoe crabs is difficult.
Yeah.
We don't really have a good way to do it other than doing some indirect things or looking at tags and seeing when they return how old these guys are. Another way they do it is by looking at these, what I talked about before, these epibionts that will attach to their carapace. So if you can age those, then you can age the minimum age of the horseshoe crab. And so they've done that with these slipper shells that will attach. Because I believe as slipper shells get older, they will grow in size. And so you can estimate the age of a slipper shell, and then from that estimate how long that adult has been alive. I definitely wouldn't have thought of that. I'm doing that. That was really smart. But horseshoe crabs will, other than predation, one of the causes of mortality, the natural mortality, is getting flipped over on the beach when they come up to spawn.
Yeah.
So, they're these little armored shells that come up to the beach, and they'll be climbing on top of each other and all these sorts of things. But then you have waves hitting them, right? And so sometimes these waves or whatever can flip them over on their back. And then once they're flipped over, they can desiccate and dry out, or raccoons or other things can come and eat them. And so that's actually what they use their tail for, is to flip themselves back over if they get overturned on the beach. And so there's been studies that have shown that high percentage of the horseshoe crabs that are overturned on the beach or that can't flip back over are ones with broken tails or really short tails. So their tail can break off for various reasons. And so if they don't have that, it's really hard for them to flip back over and right themselves on the beach. And so that is, one of the higher natural causes of mortality for adult horseshoe crabs.
Now, so far what we've discussed, it's only the tip of the iceberg, especially when it comes to connections to us. And so for that, I'm saving for a part 2. For now, before we wrap up today, though, as always, we have pretty much the same question at the end of every interview. What do you wish that people knew about the horseshoe crabs?
Ooh, well, I mean, I'm a little biased here. I studied their reproduction. So certainly I think their mating system, their mating behavior for me is super interesting. And one of the things, so with the caveat, we don't know how their behavior has changed over their evolution, right? But we see fossils where they look body plans relatively similar 450 million years ago, as we talked about earlier. If they were coming up to land to lay eggs 450 million years ago, and again, who knows if this is the case? Maybe this is something that just evolved 10 million years ago or 5 million years ago. But if they were doing it that far back, that is before there were any land animals around.
Oh, that's cool.
Right? Yeah. So they could potentially have been doing this when there are no potential predators of eating these eggs on the beach, which would be a super cool adaptation.
Yeah.
With, again, the huge caveat that we have no idea if that's what was going on.
Yeah.
Right.
And I suppose eggs don't really fossilize well either. So looking for.
Yeah. Definitely not. But just this idea, right? I mean, how many marine organisms do you know of that crawl up onto land to do their mating and lay their eggs? It's a really sort of unique. There's some fish that will spawn right on the tide lines. But I think I can't think off the top of my head very many animals that have a similar behavior. So I think it's super, super cool.
That is cool. I kind of lied. I do have one last question for you, and that is
in terms of conservation or valuing horseshoe crabs, I mean, what are your, I guess, what would your final thoughts be on that? What would be your take-home message for listeners?
Well, I think the most important things, like with most animals, is preserving habitat as much as possible. Making sure we're not just completely destroying especially their spawning habitat, of course, is important for them, as we see with the declining populations of many of the Asian species. Without that spawning habitat, it can decline pretty quickly. One of the things that is at a more like practical level of what you can do on an individual level, if you're ever at the beach where horseshoe crabs have been spawning, one of the things we tell people is just flip them.
Yeah.
So if you see a horseshoe crab stuck on its back, you can just nudge it with your toe and flip it over and let it wander and get back to the water, which is a nice, easy way to save a horseshoe crab life. But I think really it's like most things, as I said, preserving habitat is super important. Of course, they're bigger things. Microplastics, we have no idea how they might affect horseshoe crabs. But considering they're just in the sediment and eating all sorts of things out of the sediment, I wouldn't be surprised if microplastics are an issue with horseshoe crabs. They eat all sorts of little invertebrates, so anything that is preserving like ocean health, marine health, will be beneficial for horseshoe crabs for sure. But I think it's really the conservation of their spawning habitats, which probably has the biggest effect on their population health.
And that's all for today. Thank you again, Dr. Daniel Sasson, for being on our show and having that amazing conversation. It was incredibly enlightening, very insightful, and my fascination with horseshoe crabs has only increased exponentially since we had that conversation now almost 2 years ago. Close. As far as you go, the one listening right now, the one who I'm speaking into the ears of, thank you for listening. We appreciate it. Hope you learned something. And as always, the obligatory shameless self-plug. If you would like to support the wildlife and the various shows that we do, as well as the blog and all of that other good stuff, you can do that at patreon.com/DevinBoker. And until next time, part 2, peace out, rainbow trout.